delayed by 5 minutes in coming back, and that was because it has been brought to my attention that some of the people inside this venue are not able to hear everything well. I'm made to understand that that is because of noise outside, and we were discussing what may be done to try and make sure that everyone who has taken the trouble to be here is able to hear everything. Something will be done. Whether it will succeed or not, we don't know. So I just want everybody to know that we are concerned if they are here and they can't hear everything that is being said. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Minister Gordhan, before the short adjournment, we were dealing with the state of South African Airways, the swap transaction, the Airbus transaction, and then we proceeded to deal with the composition of the SAA board. The supplementary bundle at page 61 has some documentation that may be relevant. And that is a memorandum, or it's a cabinet memorandum that appears to have been declassified, that deals with the appointment and reappointment of directors to the board of South African Airways. And I wanted to draw your attention to page 64 of that document, paragraph 5.10.
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius. You said 61, eh?
Yes, 61 is the Cabinet Memorandum 5 of 2016.
I don't seem to have page 61. Actually, for some reason, I don't have pages 33 to 65 in the supplementary bundle. If there is one that is complete, then I've got, is that complete? Okay, I'll use the registrar's one.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Then maybe during the break.
Yes, during this break we will attend to it.
Okay, thank you.
Right, at page 64, Chair, do you have it, Minister?
Yes, I do.
The Cabinet Memorandum addressed by the Ministry of Finance to Cabinet in paragraph 5.10 refers to a period of 2 years during which the current chairperson would continue to occupy that position. Is there any explanation for the change from 2 years, as proposed, it appears, by the Ministry of Finance, and the compromise agreement of 1 year?
So, Chair, this is the CAB memo, which is the starting point of a discussion, either in a cabinet committee or in cabinet itself. I'm now not sure what the status of cabinet discussions is.
Well, I'm assuming, but Mr. Pretorius would know, I'm assuming that this has been declassified.
If you look at page 61, Minister, you will see there that the document was declassified on the 2nd of October 2018 by the Secretary of Cabinet.
No, I can see
now,
that.
That may permit...
It's not the
Oh,
document.
okay, you are thinking of other discussions other than what's written here.
The discussions that are pursuant on this cabinet memo being presented.
Well, let me put the question differently then. I understand your difficulty that release from classification, top secret or secret of a document is one thing. The question is cabinet discussions around them. Let me make it clear that I will not ask you about cabinet discussions, but leading up to the 2-year proposal by Treasury that Ms. Mieni would continue and the 1-year outcome, were there any discussions outside of Cabinet between officials that may be relevant to that move from 2 years to 1 year?
So, Chair, as we say in paragraph 97, that there were discussions between Presidency staff and National Treasury staff or officials during the process of compiling the final list of directors that were going to be proposed. So part of the discussion would have been the term of office of the chair, and that's reflected in the CAB memo. What we need is the cabinet minutes, which would record the outcome of this discussion. And as I recall it, we can check it for you, in terms of our records, the final agreement was 1 year.
And that would have been discussed in Cabinet and decided upon in Cabinet.
Aren't you putting him in a difficult when you say in cabinet?
Well, in theory, such a decision would be made pursuant to a Cabinet memo without going into any
So
detail.
let me be an amateur lawyer, Chair, and submit the following, that if one gets a declassified set of minutes of this meeting, it would actually give you the result of the meeting.
If one looks at page 60, one will see there the minute of Cabinet that
Right.
I presume you're referring to.
Yes. Page-
Part of the minute, and under paragraph B, it reads, approved that Ms. D. Mieni be reappointed as chairperson of a board for a period of 1 year with a view to ensuring continuity and a seamless transition for the newly appointed board and deputy chairperson. But if I may run ahead a little, that's the decision. The question goes to the discussion leading up to the decision, and I understand your reservations in that regard.
So, Chair, that's the copy of a page of the cabinet minutes, I would imagine, and it confirms what we've said.
Would you then deal, please, with the statement at paragraph 98 and 99, and in particular your relationship with investors during 2016?
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius and Mr. Gordhan. May I just take you back to paragraph 97 of your statement, which you just dealt with before we took the tea break. That paragraph indicates that there were discussions between the presidency and National Treasury, which resulted in the compromise that Ms. Mieni would continue as chairperson for 1 further year. the involvement of the presidency in the appointment or reappointment of members of boards of SOEs have been a normal thing? Is that a normal thing or not?
Not in the form, Chair, that this particular board demonstrates. So you'll see that the Cabinet memorandum at 61 is dated August. I was appointed in December. Let's leave December aside, take January. So that's what I said earlier on, Chair, that it took a formidable amount of time to get to this point where we had an agreed list. And let me clarify that from a Treasury point of view, our interest was not about the politics of the issue. And as we are now learning with the SOEs and SOE boards, that if we don't have the right combination of skills, integrity, and courage, because courage now becomes an important factor. You can actually see something going wrong, you can have a forensic report presented to you, but if one doesn't have the courage collectively or individually to take the necessary action to deal with malfeasance or poor corporate governance, then you would be failing, one would be failing in one's fiduciary responsibilities to that institution. So how do we put the best possible team together that has the experience? Now, the airline business is not replete with experience in our kind of context. It's a fairly narrow band of people. You will see that in the current SAA environment, which I inherited, the senior management team had to be supplemented by an international expert, Mr. Davies, who has, according to his records, turned around, so to speak, 5 other airlines. So he has the global perspective on airlines, the kind of experience of where the key touch points would be and what a turnaround plan would actually require. So our interest here was to ensure that we get the right skill set on the one hand, and the right leadership and integrity as well. Clearly there was resistance to that. And as perhaps the Commission goes into greater detail into some of the difficulties that SAA faced from, say, 2009 onwards, there were difficulties before then as well. It would encounter the kind of events and decisions made at a government level or at a board level or even at a management level, which presents us with the kind of difficulties that we actually have today. And we find that as a repeated phenomenon in other SOEs as well. So this was extraordinary. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps you could assist us then, Minister, in relation to the engagements between officials from the Presidency and officials from National Treasury, which obviously would have taken place outside of Cabinet. Who would be the person to assist the Commission?
Mr. Fuzila.
Thank you. Then if we may go to paragraph 98 of your statement, where you describe the meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland during January and February 2016. Would you deal with that, please?
With your permission, before I get to that point, Mr. Pretorius and Chair,
yes,
can I introduce 2 elements of the issue we discussed earlier on, which is the point at which I was reintroduced into the Treasury, if I may. The first, I made reference to an announcement from the Presidency on Minister Nene's future in relation to the BRICS Bank. That apparently is at page 418 of your first bundle, just to help you in that regard. And the second point, Chair, is with reference to paragraph 80, at page 30 of the statement, which we skipped. And it reads, the decision also ushered in a period, that is the decision to bring in Mr. Van Rooyen, of close scrutiny of institutional stability and policy certainty by global ratings agencies. It's a point I made yesterday, that when, and I suppose this is a sign of the times globally as well, so we should not say that this is limited to South Africa, but we have our own specific issues that we deal with here, that the rating agencies would be more concerned in terms of their normal metrics and calculations about debt and about interest and about revenue and about your capability and willingness to pay debt off and so on. What this change in the position of Minister of Finance did was to bring about a new focus, which is institutional stability and policy certainty. So the policy certainty is the issue that at page 425 in the press statement on the changeover, which introduced me into the Treasury again, indicates the bottom of that page. But I think the point I want to draw to your attention is that this was the first signs of what the public narrative and or analysis was beginning to indicate at the time, that the Treasury was one of the key targets of state capture. And if one looks at the Gupta emails and all of the circumstances that surround Mr. Van Rooyen, then we begin to understand, by virtue of his associations, that this was the first step in the takeover. And the particular interest that some of his people had shown, for example, in SAA and so on, is a reflection of that. And yesterday we also referred, if you remember, to the presentation prepared by the Treasury on the economic outlook being emailed in that 2-day period to outsiders. I think the email was read, here we have it, gentlemen, or something to that effect. So it was just to draw your attention to that before I get back to paragraph 98.
Thank you.
At 98, Chair, for some time now, it's if you like, tradition that during, I think it's usually the 3rd week of January, that the World Economic Forum meets in the very cold atmosphere of Davos. Why Davos, I don't know, and why we have to be there in snowbound Davos, I don't know either. But these meetings are an important opportunity for governments to present themselves to investors, ratings agencies, and attract investment into South Africa, but also create a positive narrative around a country. So in many years, particular governments will take over, inverted commas, or have a significant event. So leading up to the World Cup in 2010, South Africa was given a lot of prominence at Davos, just by way of illustration. 99 says that on that occasion in early 2016, I was approached by South African business leaders, as an aside, at the WEF meeting for urgent discussions on how to avoid a sovereign credit rating downgrade and how to inspire confidence in the South African economy and government after the drastic and damaging changes at the Treasury. This resulted in an urgent meeting convened with business leaders upon my return to South Africa from WEF, and the CEO initiative was formed out of these engagements. So if you go back to 2016, you'll find that business, labor, civil society all became part of this process of, on the one hand, reintroducing confidence in our economy, secondly, demonstrating that the Treasury would do the right things in terms of the issues that are raised in that press statement, and that thirdly, there would be a contestation of any further moves on state capture in relation to the Treasury as well. This was followed by an investment roadshow by Labour government and business representatives to overseas investors who are invested in our economy, and in particular in South Africa's debt during March 2016. I'll come back to that in a moment. At paragraph 101, we say, in addition, the CEO initiative launched a fund of 1.5 billion rands for supporting small business, particularly black-owned small businesses, as well as the Youth Employment Service as proposed and championed by the then Deputy President Ramaphosa, which will ensure that big business provide work and entrepreneurial opportunities to 1 million young people over a 3-year period. Further possibilities for additional investment in the South African economy were explored during these various initiatives as well. So, notwithstanding the fact that Minister van Rooyen was replaced on the 13th of December, this section articulates the concerns that the business sector had, and in particular concerns about what the credit rating agencies do, and that's in relation to paragraph 80 that I just read out. And if there was a downgrade, and essentially what a downgrade means, or what a credit rating means, is that it determines your credit worthiness. So how much of money can anyone lend this country or this individual with a sufficient sense of assurance that that money would actually be paid back as and when it is actually due. The lower the credit rating, the higher the interest rate you would pay. So the United States at one stage fell from a AAA to a AA, for example, but the other countries like Japan, because of the strength of their economy, I think still remain a AAA rating. But if you go to their debt to GDP, it's close to 200%. I think the number would still be approximately there at the current point in time. So depending on the strength of your economy and your ability and credit record, which is what any financial institution will do when you ask for credit, a home loan, a car loan, or whatever the case might be. So credit ratings are important, particularly if you borrow in a foreign environment, and but even in a local environment as well. In our case, as I remember the numbers, the foreign borrowing in foreign currency, that means in dollars or euros or yen, is limited to 10% of our overall borrowing. So that if there are fluctuations in the exchange rate, it doesn't have a significantly negative effect on the economy. There are many examples today around the world, particularly on the African continent, countries like Ghana and Zambia, when oil prices were high, borrowed a lot of money and began to spend it either in public servant salary increases or infrastructure projects and so on. And then the oil prices fell, and we're going south for some time, which means that their reliance on oil revenue wasn't going to enable them to pay back the loans that they had borrowed, and much of that borrowing was in foreign currency. So your currency depreciates. That means that where you would have originally paid, say, 10 units of your currency for $1, you can now say that you're going to pay 15 units of your currency to the dollar because of the depreciation in your currency. That means your debt burden actually increases quite significantly. And many of these countries then find themselves either at the doors of the Chinese government, and I'll explain why in a moment, or at the doors of the IMF, or sometimes the World Bank before the IMF. Now, even today, there's a stigma attached to getting any assistance from the IMF, because IMF's past history has been, we lend money to poor countries, but we also impose very harsh conditions, which generally means that social spending has to reach austerity levels, and that begins to impact on the local population. More recently, of course, the IMF has changed a bit, but the stigma still remains. So if you say that country X, like South Africa, is now borrowing money from the IMF or seeking loans from the IMF or seeking a facility from the IMF, meaning that you don't draw on the loan, but you have a facility that you can draw on if you need to, then you are now IMF dependent. And invariably conditions begin to be attached to that loan as well. So coming back to the borrowing story, 10% maximum of our borrowing is in foreign currency, but even our rand-denominated bonds, that is money that we've raised locally, 40% of that is owned by foreigners. So if you create the wrong level of stability in the country, high levels of uncertainty, tomorrow morning bonds can be sold and the money can leave this country. So Treasury, amongst other institutions, also monitors on a daily basis how much of money has come into bonds, into equities, or left bonds and left equities as well, so that it gives you some sense for what is going on. So the concerns that the CEO initiative had, or business people had, was about this set of issues. The second important point here is this was the first time that the normal roadshow is undertaken by Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank. It's the first time we actually have business and labor with us, so that you had Team South Africa going out. And that made quite an impact in March 2016. And that practice has continued up to a point and into the present as well. So that covers those two issues. But one of the things that we did at the CEO initiative is also to challenge the CEOs, that they shouldn't just ask government to do X and Y. They themselves, as the business sector, need to come forward and demonstrate, firstly, their solidarity with communities that have not been part of the economy in an effective sense. And so the 1.5 billion rand fund was created. That money came in literally 2 to 3 months from corporate South Africa once the concept of the fund was clarified. And that fund went through some difficulties in the recent past, but it's operational now. Adrian Gore of Discovery, for example, and Brian Joffe are the two patrons of that fund, and there's a steering committee that then runs it. Equally, the initiative of President Ramaphosa on the 1 million jobs for young people is also quite a crucial one to get young people exposed to job opportunities and the work environment, and in a sense create some kind of CV.
We then get, Minister Gordhan, to the events, further events of your second term as Minister of Finance, and you deal in paragraph 102 and following of steps that were taken directly in relationship to yourself at the head of the, or at the hands of the law enforcement agencies. Would you deal with paragraph 102 and following, please?
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Pretorius, the 102 essentially makes reference to the famous 27 questions. And here, what we had in a week or so, say about 2 weeks prior to the budget in 2016, my office gets repeated calls from Mr. Ntlemeza to say that he wants to see me, even if it's for 5 minutes. So I accommodate that at some stage. And what he communicates in that discussion is that he wishes to inform me that there's some investigation going on in SARS and SAA. Doesn't give me any detail. He just wanted me to know. He'll return to me at some stage with more details, and he leaves. Then, in the week before the budget, again calls to my office from Mr. Ntlemeza. I don't know if generals keep their titles or not after they leave, so I refer to him as Mr. Saying that he needs to deliver an envelope directly to me. But we were obviously very busy in the final stages of preparing the budget documentation, as I explained yesterday. And at one stage, we and by we, I mean Mr. Jonas and I were in the corridor, and we heard that there was yet another call. And if I recall, Mr. Jonas spoke to him to say, relax, can we finish the budget? We'll come and collect the envelope, whatever it is. We thought we had that agreement with him, but the next thing we have is the delivery of an envelope to Treasury.
Are you at paragraph 104?
Yeah.
Just before you go there, may I ask you a question about paragraph 103? You make the allegation there, the statement rather, that you believe that the capture of the Hawks under General Ntlhameza was central to the state capture project. Would you just outline to the Chair the reasons for that conclusion that you reached?
Well, if you go back to the hypothesis around state capture and what I said in the early parts of yesterday, the capture of and repurposing, as the academics would call it, of key institutions is a crucial element of state capture. And apart from, let's call it, the set of extractive institutions, that is, institutions from which you're going to take money, the two other institutions that needed to be attended to, if you like, as part of the overall scheme would be your key investigating arm and your key prosecuting arm. I think my colleague, Mr. Taylor, would be able to give you a lot more details about the status of Hawks at the moment. But although I have no personal knowledge of this, from interactions with various people, what Mr. Ntlhameza did at the Hawks, which I described as a pattern earlier on in the statement, is in these institutions you just remove the good people at the top level and replace them. And rebuilding those institutions, as I said yesterday, means finding out who are the good people and who are the not so good people, who are committed to the cause of democracy and the proper management of investigations, and who's part of any form of ill intent or malfeasance, or serving the interests of those who want to engage in corruption arising from state capture. So the Hawks certainly, and that has been a feature over the last few years. Some so-called infringements are investigated, others are not. If you look at, for example, the conduct of, I think it's the General Ledwaba, in relation to SARS and accessing documents and victimizing Mr. Symington, who had a particular legal opinion, then that will be one illustration of the kind of activity that they actually engaged in. And there are many instances that are in the public record of the fact that in the early days of 2017, when the Gupta leaks first emerged, or even the Estina Dairy issue, which is the simplest of the transactions, by the way. And in money terms, it's 200 or 300 million rands that we're talking about, compared to the billions that have disappeared out of Transnet in relation to the locomotive transaction. At what stage are these investigations? And all of that, I think, amongst progressives in South Africa and those watching developments within the state, for them, it's quite clear that the Hawks have not been performing their role. And secondly, and far more importantly, they need to be strengthened once again, which is probably what Minister Taylor is doing, so that they can play their rightful investigative role.
Yes, you've raised questions, Minister, about the Gupta email leaks and the consequences or lack of consequences from an investigatorial and prosecutorial angle. Do you know what happened to the personnel in the Hawks under General Ntlhameza? You've given a general overview of changes in personnel. Have you any idea of the extent?
No, I think the
changes?
detail, Chair, would be available from people directly involved. All we have is a general understanding of the pattern that emerged.
You then were dealing with the delivery of the envelope to your officers on the 19th of February 2016. What happened then?
So I say in paragraph 104, Chair, that on or about the 19th of February 2016, that is the week before the budget, and budgets are had on a Wednesday, are delivered on a Wednesday, budget speeches. In the week before my budget speech, an envelope was hand-delivered to the Treasury by General Entlemezas, or at his insistence, I beg your pardon. This envelope contained 27 questions addressed to me from the Hawks and demanding that they be answered by 2 March 2016. The questions related to the High-Risk Investigations Unit within SARS formed years earlier. Charges against me relating to that unit had been filed by Mr. Moyane on 15 May 2015.
Just before you continue, Minister, was the delay between the 15th of May 2015 and February 2016 in processing these charges ever explained to you?
No, but what it does bring to the fore, Chairperson, is one observation that I could have made earlier on, and that is that being appointed on the 13th of December 2015 is one thing in the midst of the turmoil. But fairly soon thereafter, from late January on, it was quite clear to me from various signals, this one in particular, and what followed this particular event, that a mistake had been made, inverted commas, in locating me at the Treasury, and that something needed to be done now to get rid of me. And my submission to you would be that some very harsh lessons were learned from the turmoil caused by the dismissal of Mr. Nene and the replacement of Mr. Nene by Mr. Van Rooyen and whatever background he came from. And so you couldn't repeat that exercise of firing somebody again so soon thereafter. So other means needed to be found to, in essence, as you will see later, force me to resign. And pretty much the kind of bullying that we see at the moment is the kind of bullying and intimidation and harassment that the 27 questions and their delivery begin to introduce in our lives at the Treasury, but also in the lives of different persons, including myself. So, because there's no other explanation why for almost a year, a sitting president who actually appointed one to a particular position and said, you have a job to do, and that is to stabilize the markets. A month later or so, then allows his appointees to essentially start the process of harassment. And throughout the period between February and about October, November, the one narrative that I would hear is that this is all about forcing you to resign, and comrades within the ANC and colleagues within cabinet and people outside in civil society and the South African Communist Party and so on would say, don't resign. You have a job to do, and you've heard me say that on various platforms at that time. Do your job. And if he doesn't want you there, then he must fire you. And I think that for me is the context that we find ourselves in. And so where firing is not going to be a palatable option, and having learned from the turmoil and almost panicked during that turmoil of December 2015, a different formula needed to be found. And this securocratic formula is what was found to try to intimidate, harass, and literally chase one out of the office.
Given your understanding of the context within which these 27 questions were addressed to you, did you then approach President Zuma, former President Zuma?
Yes, I was obviously extremely upset, but also concerned at what was going on. And at 1:05, I arranged to visit the then president later that day, Thursday or Friday, to present the correspondence and questions from the Hawks to him and to ask him whether he was aware of and agreed with this law enforcement action against me. If I may continue, during that meeting, I objected strongly about this persecution and asked former President Zuma whether political activists like myself must now prepare to be eliminated during the democratic era, even though we had survived the oppression, and I might say 3 different detentions in my case, under the security police in the apartheid era. In response to my objection, he merely flipped the pages of the letter. He said he would, finally said he would discuss the matter with the then Minister of Police, Mr. Nhleko. I received no information from the former president in this regard subsequent to this meeting. So what that describes, Chair, is I received the letter, I look at the questions, I'm concerned and angry about this particular form of intimidation that was going on, and angry particularly because anybody in government would know the importance of a budget speech and budget day in the welfare of the country as a whole. Now, who is it with what kind of mindset that would want to be disruptive on the Thursday or Friday before the budget, when we've got to finalize the budget documentation and the budget speech over that particular weekend? What kind of mindset actually informs you to say, I have to deliver this prior to the budget? Were they expecting that I would resign when I deliver the budget speech? I don't know, because the rest of the paragraphs that follow is about appealing to me not to do anything that would actually upset the country and investors and the well-being of the economy as well. So it's a fascinating question that I've never quite understood, except to say that this might be a bit of hubris and bullishness, replicating or mimicking in many ways the tactics of the previous security police that many of us, as you know, are familiar with. That regardless of consequences, regardless of context, we'll do whatever we feel like. And for those of us who are not too familiar with the security police of the past, a constable in the security police could dictate to a captain in the uniformed branch. And the uniformed branch would be literally scared of the security police. When we were in detention, you could actually see this interaction between the different players. So there was a unique set of powers on the one hand, but also authority, informally or formally, that the security police had. And that's the only explanation one can think about. Apparently, Mr. Ntlemeza had some background in the Transkei Security Police in his previous life.
When you raised this issue with the former president, does your statement say he did nothing more than just flip through the pages of the letter, or
Yes.
did he say anything?
Nope.
So your meeting lasted a very short time.
Yes.
He did say he would discuss the matter with the then Minister of Police.
That's on the record, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And then would you please deal with the meeting that you were called to on Monday, the 22nd of February, 2016? This, as I understand your evidence, was shortly prior to the budget presentation in Parliament.
So, as I said yesterday, Chair, the budget documentation is completed the Friday night or Saturday morning, and then sent to the printers by late on Saturday. And there's a whole process of security and so on that's involved with that. Then the budget speech is prepared on the basis of the finalized numbers in the budget documentation, of which the budget review is the principal, if you like, overview text. And there's a thick book called Estimates of National Expenditure, which indicates what is allocated to each department and what their programs are that they will spend the money on. So there's a fair amount of complexity involved in preparing that document. So even by Monday, we will be finalizing, or up to Tuesday morning, we would be finalizing the budget speech. And what that involves is to take the numbers that are available and the kind of tax choices and other choices that government might have made, and provide a narrative which is consistent with the times. And as much as possible to create some optimism in the public mind and in the markets that we understand the context, B, we have a plan, C, we are working within the kind of frameworks that, particularly the fiscal framework that we had been pursuing before that, and D, indicate what the direction might be in numbers terms over a 3-year period. And those are all, of course, estimates, but there's a particular science and art, if you like, at that, because estimates very rarely become real in actual terms. So that's the context, and then, as I say in paragraph 109, I was requested to attend a meeting with the Secretary General, Mr. Mantash, Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Duarte, and Treasurer General, Dr. Mkhize of the ANC. I explained, I've got this speech to finish, and Mr. Mantash said, please come. So I took an afternoon flight from Cape Town, and then there was a meeting at a nearby hotel to the airport. And as I say here, I interrupted preparation for the budget and flew to Johannesburg from Cape Town to meet them that afternoon. The 27 questions and this abuse of law enforcement powers for political objectives was discussed with them. I was assured that a political solution would be found to this political problem. Now, essentially, this was about tempering or preempting what they thought might be an excessive reaction to the 27 questions. So I assured them that as somebody who tries to always take account of national interest, we would not deliberately play a disruptive role, but at the same time, the 27 questions are unwelcome and clearly designed for political purposes to harass one, although the full context would become clearer in the months that actually followed. What's fascinating is the next paragraph, that this was correspondence and a set of questions directed to me, which I then gave to the lawyers to deal with.
I'm sorry, before you get to that paragraph, let's just go back to that last sentence of paragraph 109. It says, I was assured that a political solution will be found to the political problem. Would I be right to deduce from this sentence that those that were at that meeting seemed or took the matter, the problem, as being a political problem rather than anything else, or is it just your own description?
Well, it's a political problem, Chair, in the sense that here you have one arm of the state attacking another arm of the state without any clear basis for that. And that it had long been proven by then that the kind of events that they wanted to cover in the 27 questions had very logical, reasonable, and legal answers to all of those questions that were available, both in the public domain and otherwise. So yes, it was a political solution, or a political problem, in the sense that, yes, under a particular president, you have a Minister of Finance who's got a critical role to play in a few days' time, not on his own personal behalf, but on behalf of government, being tampered around in this kind of way. and that this could lead to serious disorientation. Now imagine going back to the whole Treasury team, which we didn't do, by the way, and saying, look, this is the kind of pressure we are under. And what happens on that Wednesday morning, if I may just take a minute to advise you, Chair, is that on Wednesday from about 6 o'clock on budget day, journalists, some of them might be here, actually come to Parliament. They have their cell phones taken away. Their computers don't have any transmission devices or facility on them. They're then given, they get into a lockup until 2 o'clock, and they then are given a set of the budget documentation. From about 7:30 onwards, officials walk around amongst the journalists to help them with answers to any questions that they might need clarity on, technically and otherwise. Sometimes we ourselves used to do that as well. At about 10:30, those officials come back to the minister's office and say, look, these are the 5 or 6 top questions that we were asked. At about 10:30 or 11, we have a press conference with the journalists that's embargoed, so they can't write anything. I mean, they can't transmit anything, but they can start writing their stories and prepare their stories in advance. And we take questions from the journalists as well. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the words Madam Speaker or Mr. Speaker are articulated, is when they can press the button and transmit their story. So that's the context on a Wednesday, which means that you want, if you like, maximum sanity and stability in that environment to be able to give the right kind of answers in all those different fora that we have to actually appear.
Thank you. Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. In paragraph 110, you say that the 27 questions were leaked to the media the day after the budget. I'd like to just deal very briefly and at a very general level with the 27 questions themselves. Obviously, it's not appropriate at this stage to go into the merits and demerits of all the issues that were raised in the 27 questions. But do you have a general comment on the content of the questions and why you reached the conclusion that it was improper to visit these questions upon you?
Well, the first point, Chair, is that which I was beginning to make when I was taken back to 109 in 110, is that here you have a letter and questions directed from the Hawks to myself. And as I indicated, I then hand them to lawyers. And one would expect that that remains in the confidential domain. But that Thursday, which is immediately after the Wednesday budget speech delivery, the 27 questions and I think the correspondence were then leaked to the media, which means that there's an agenda. And then subsequent correspondence was also leaked, and prior to this there was a pattern of leaking as well in relation to other issues. So who were the forces that were managing all of this is an intriguing question for the Commission to look into, because clearly there was some orchestration going on. And if one wants to now regularly leak information as opposed to give either the recipient or themselves an opportunity to address in a fair and objective way these sorts of issues with the public, then one must ask what sinister motives are actually guiding the people concerned. So you can see amongst the questions, were you briefed on the strategic operations of the unit? Do you know anything about Sunday evenings, which is still the subject of another prosecution.
Just before you go
attempt.
on, Minister, the questions themselves appear for record purposes at page 432 of the bundle N1B. But in any event, at page 432 of the bundle, I'm informed that it's part of the second bundle, N1B, not the supplementary bundle. I have it in N1A, but be that as it may, it's at page 432, Chair.
So the exhibit in which the questions appear is exhibit what?
Just give me 431.
I think somebody on your left wants to give you the answer.
Well, because I intend not to be ruled by the majority in this case. May I, it's annexure 20, and my informant on my left was correct. I must defer.
Which exhibit first?
Well, it's not all the same, but N1B, I'm informed.
Is it not one of the 6 that we have always
Yes, it
had
is.
since yesterday?
It's one of those. It's the
And-
second one.
And didn't you say they are all marked now?
Yes,
Thought
I
you
did.
said so.
And if they're not, I'll take full responsibility.
Well, there's exhibit N1C. That is not the one.
N1B,
N1B.
yes, please. Page 429.
Okay. Okay. What is the page again?
Thank you, Chair. Page 430 is the beginning of the press article, but it lists the questions according to the press article verbatim at page 432.
Okay, I've got it.
Do you have that list before you?
Yes, I do.
Just generally, and without going to the merits of each and every question, otherwise we'll be here for months,
You will be.
in any event. The scope of the questions, what issues generally did they deal with? Had these issues surfaced before? Had they been dealt with? If you could just deal with it in that light, please.
No, the issues had surfaced before. I don't have all the information in front of me, but you recall me making reference to leaks to the Sunday Times chair and the apology that subsequently followed when editors changed from Ms. Opelt to the current editor. And there are many books and so on available now which demonstrate the malfeasance that actually underpinned the leak stories. For example, I mean, we've had references to shebeens on the one hand, but you also had references to brothels on the other hand. Neither could be discovered, interestingly. So that's just one illustration of, if you like, a security operation of one kind or another. The second is, if you take some of the latter questions pertaining to Mr. Pillay, who was then Deputy Commissioner at SARS. Now, so the 27 questions, there was a leak again to the Sunday Times about this issue. Then it appears in the 27 questions. Then it was the subject of formal charges from the NPA on the 11th of October 2016, with charges were withdrawn on the 31st of October 2016. And later in the statement, I indicate to you that now the public protector wants to look at the same issues as well. So what's going on? These are simple legal matters where there's an immense amount of clarity on what is right and what is wrong. And when you are at a deficit in terms of finding plausible reasons to do the kind of things that you want to do, then you really scrape the bottom of the barrel, including using slogans developed by Bell Pottinger and so on. So that's in the Gupta emails as well. It's not my concoction. So what the conclusion one can come to following this, I mean, I've had family members who have had demonstrations in front of their house by some of the protagonists of the views that I'm talking about. What for? If I'm just an ordinary guy, forgive the colloquialism again, doing a piece of work, nobody can find any fault with what I'm doing or my team is doing, and we are doing collectively. Why all this narrative and actions that we actually see to attempt to bully and intimidate and misinform the public, an issue that I'll come back to later. So the short answer to the question, Mr. Pretorius and Chair, would be that those would be the reasons that I suggest underpin the 27 questions and whatever follows.
As I understand your evidence, if I may summarize, you regarded the subject matter of the charges as being matters which had been raised, questions had been answered, and as I understand your evidence, you say that that was an abuse of power. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is there not an argument that could be put to you that these were genuine investigations in relation to matters of potential unlawful activity?
You know, there's a term, Chair, that Bill Clinton was, I think, made famous for. It's the economy is stupid, meaning, you know, you've got to look at a wider set of issues when one answers a question like that. So what's the context? Context matters. You're not looking at one isolated issue in its own right and saying, is this a possible, if it was just that, then it's very easy to accept the bona fides of a general inquiry. We just want to know from you, can you give us any more clarity about X and Y and Z? Oh, you'll be welcome, you'll get a cup of tea, and we'll talk about it as the public protector did, the previous one, and we'll give you the information that we have, or I have, in a particular regard. Why all this intrigue, delivering envelopes prior to the budget, leaking the letter, etc., and what follows later, on the same subject matter? So there's a consistency, both in the narrative and in the actions that are actually taken. So there has to be something more than just a genuine inquiry, if one can call it that.
We could then move on to your evidence, thank you, Minister, at paragraph 114.1, where you deal with an issue that is encapsulated in paragraph 1.7 of our terms of reference, and about which evidence will be given later this week, and that is the appointment of advisors to Mr. Nene's replacement, Mr. Van Rooyen.
Well, before you go there, Mr. Pretorius, Minister, at paragraph 111 of your statement, you mentioned that State Security Minister Mr. David Mahlobo and Minister Nhleko held a joint press conference on 2 March 2016 defending the investigation and the timing of the questions posed to me by the Hawks. Maybe I can understand Mr. Nhleko there, but why would Mr. Mahlobo have been there? He's not Minister of Police. Do you know?
It's a good question, Chair, and I was going to take Mr. Pretorius back to it in two respects. One is in respect of what you've just said. So why is the State Security Minister always present, if one puts it very euphemistically, when these sorts of occurrences arise? And it's a fair question to ask. And the second is that we had in fact prepared for the Commission Chair clips of these press conferences to demonstrate A, the language used, B, the explanations offered. And in this particular instance, it was a cabinet meeting at which all of us were present. And the cabinet meeting ends, and suddenly I'm told that these two ministers are having a press conference. So it's about what? No, it's something to do with these matters around the 27 questions. So only later, of course, I hear what they have had to say. But again, it provides further evidence that this was not just a gentle academic, objective legal inquiry that we were talking about. Why must two ministers actually get involved? If you are leaving it to a law enforcement agency to do its work in an objective and legal way, and even if there are criticisms, let the agency defend itself or explain its conduct in whatever way it might actually want to explain its conduct. But you had this particular press conference. Now, there was an apprehension on the side of the legal team that if we attempt to show the clip, maybe the technology might not be able to cope. But during lunch, we could see, if you want to, Chair, whether we could get the technology to work so that, or you could view it in your own time, because we have, what do you call these things? Links to YouTube videos, which you could look at.
We have downloaded those, which are
Yes.
available for viewing if we have time.
Okay. One would have expected that, well, maybe I shouldn't say one would have expected. Did you expect that if Mr. Ntlemeza was to serve you with those kinds of questions, is it something you would have expected your colleague in cabinet for the police to, as a matter of courtesy, mention to you? Is it something that you expected he would have known about, or not really? It might be difficult to say.
It's a good question, Chair. I think there's nothing illegal with saying that I'm sorry, but this agency is looking into this matter, and you can expect X. I'm not involved in the investigation. I'm not involved in the detail, but they will explain to you whatever they need to do. So please cooperate with them, or whatever the case is. So that certainly is a collegial courtesy that could be extended if there's the will to do so.
And before the two ministers held the press conference, they did not speak to you about these questions, these 27 questions?
No.
Okay, thank you.
You've related, Minister Gordhan, the fact that you were called to a meeting days before you were due to present the budget speech on the 22nd of February. You've related the manner in which the questions were delivered. Just to round off that evidence, at page 442 of bundle N1B, is the press record of the press conference to which you've just referred.
Yes.
The chair asked about the involvement of the Minister of State Security, and a remark is made, then on the second page of that report at page 443, the penultimate paragraph, which begins "on the other hand." Would you please read that paragraph onto the record?
Sure. Chair, it reads, on the other hand, the Minister of State Security, David Mashlobo, who sat next to Nhleko, was as cool as a cucumber, inscrutable as one would expect from a man who holds a lot of secrets. He calmly waited as the Minister of Police read out a patchy history of the apparent origins of the rogue unit saga, adding that the Hawks' questions to Finance Minister Gordhan did not mean he himself is facing an investigation or is even being charged. This is disingenuous because I was charged eventually. That's the close of the quotation.
Is it correct? I really wanted to draw the Chair's attention to the reported allegation, and I stress that it is a reported allegation, that the investigation or charges were non-existent. You say that's not correct.
The charges were, sorry?
That you had not been charged. As I understand it, there had been a charge previously.
Not previously, subsequently.
Subsequently. The Moyane,
You mean the laying of a charge, Chair?
yes, the charges that were brought against you and filed by Mr. Moyane
in May.
were in May 2015.
That's right. I
These
only
events
became
were
aware of
happening
that
in
much later.
2016.
Okay, I think the two of you spoke at the same time.
I beg your pardon.
I'm sorry.
But I think you wanted to give the time when something happened in May.
So I think Mr. Pretorius' question, sorry, my apologies for interjecting in that way. Mr. Pretorius' question is with reference to a charge laid by Mr. Moyane at the Brooklyn Police Station sometime in May 2015. I'm referring to the charges lodged or delivered to us on the 11th of October 2016 by the NPA.
Oh.
Nevertheless, they covered the same material, at least in part.
Same material. May I, if you don't mind, before we skip to 114, at 113, Chair,
Yes.
may I read the latter part of, or maybe the whole of 113. This set of events, combined with what is set out below, was the beginning of what appeared to be a campaign to force me to resign as Minister of Finance and continue the efforts to capture the Treasury thereafter. I believe that my reappointment had thwarted these efforts, and I believe Mr. Nene was removed from the National Executive for the same reason, to obtain full control of the Treasury. Now, I want to, if I may, Mr. Pretorius and Chair, draw your attention to annexure, might be 23. I beg your pardon, Chair, or it's actually attached to some of the other documents, but page 473 of bundle N1B.
The one we
right?
just used, the one we just used,
Yes,
yeah.
It's annexure
So, but-
22.
yes.
So what is the page?
473.
473. Thank you.
And this is also important, Chair, for the record, because it fits into the conversation or engagement we've just had on this matter. May I just read some paragraphs here?
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. The recent media reports about my arrest, so there were also media reports about me getting arrested, imminent or not, have been extremely distressing for my family and me. I cannot believe that I am being investigated and could possibly be charged with something I am completely innocent of. I have answered the questions submitted by the Hawks, as you pointed out, Chair, and I have not heard from them. I was not aware of any impending charges or further investigations until the reports in the past weekend. It is indeed true that no one is above the law, but no one should be subjected to the manipulation of the law and agencies for ulterior motives. Throughout my 45 years of activism, I have worked for the advancement of the ANC, our constitution, and our democratic government. I would never have thought that individuals within the very agencies of this government would now conspire to intimidate and harass me and my family. I have met with my lawyers to obtain their advice. They will be approaching the leadership of both the Hawks and the NPA for further information and clarity. The next paragraph refers to the work we did at SARS. The malicious rumors and accusations about espionage activities are false and manufactured for other motives. There have also been reports of business people claiming inside knowledge of or influence over state institutions. If such reports are true, that alleged conduct will undermine the integrity and honesty within the Treasury and key institutions. It's particularly painful to me, and I'm sure to many earnest Democrats, to witness this unrestrained attack on honest and hardworking people and institutions meant to strengthen our democracy. Millions of people will pay the price. There will be less money to relieve poverty and support job creation programs if this subversion of democracy is left unrestrained and unchallenged. I appeal to all South Africans to protect the National Treasury staff, who have diligently, honestly, and skillfully served the national interest to the best of their ability. They are recognized worldwide for their professionalism and competence. So that also gives you some context and the kind of concerns that were prevalent at the time, both at a personal level, but more importantly at an institutional level as well.
That document from which you've read is a media statement made by yourself as Minister of Finance on the 17th of May, 2016.
That's right.
You have made this statement before you referred to that press statement, Minister, in paragraph 113 about how you saw and how you regarded what you have described as a campaign to force you to resign. In paragraph 114, you provide some detail in relation, I presume, to that understanding of the events yourself.
Again, Chair, if I can just read this. I refer the Commission to the contents of subsequent media reports that reveal that shareholders in Gupta-linked consultancy group Trillion allegedly were warned in advance, or rather informed in advance, that Mr. Nene would be fired as Finance Minister, and that Trillion, the company, planned to exploit access to the Treasury under Mr. Nene's replacement, Mr. Van Rooyen. Mr. Eric Wood, Trillion's Chief Executive Officer at the time, denied the allegations and suggestions that he, Trillion, and other Gupta-connected individuals had profited from the market turmoil that followed Mr. Nene's removal. Evidence provided by a Trillion whistleblower to the parliamentary inquiry into Eskom established that Wood may have profited thanks to his prior knowledge of the removal of Mr. Nene. That witness is a lady, Ms. Masilo Motepu, who was very courageous to be a whistleblower and made her appearance at the parliamentary inquiry. The Commission will benefit from her evidence to you as well. Similarly, Advocate Budlander, sorry.
I'm sorry. Would the legal team have the name already, or?
Yes, we have the statement.
Oh, you've got a statement.
The statement was presented to Advocate Budlander in his inquiry, and findings were made by Advocate Budlander. But let's just put it in context, Minister. The evidence to the parliamentary inquiry into Eskom was given whilst you were in Parliament, as I understand it. Were you present when that evidence was given?
Yes.
If I may refer you to page 475 of bundle N1B. This article refers to the version of Eric Wood in relation to that evidence,
That's correct.
just for record purposes. Chair, I'm informed by the minority that it's almost 1 o'clock, and perhaps this is an appropriate time.
And do you allow yourself this time to be ruled by the minority?
A whole 2 minutes before 1. Yes.
Okay, thank you. We are going to take the lunch adjournment and we will resume at 2 o'clock.
Thank you, Chair.
We adjourn.